By the spring of 1945, Adolf Hitler's empire was collapsing. Berlin was surrounded, cities were in ruins, and Germany's armies were retreating on every front. Inside a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, the men who had once controlled Europe faced the end of his rule, and the betrayal of those who had built it with him. Only a few years earlier, the situation had been completely different. At the height of his power, Hitler was celebrated by his generals. He had rebuilt the military, defied the Treaty of Versailles, and led Germany to a series of stunning victories. France had fallen in weeks, Poland in days. To many in the officer corps, he seemed unstoppable, a leader with an unshakable will and perfect instincts. But that image began to crack as the war expanded. Hitler's style of command was unlike any in modern history. He distrusted his generals, believed his intuition was superior to experience, and made strategic decisions based on ideology rather than logic. When his officers warned him about overextension or exhaustion, he dismissed them. He wanted obedience, not advice. The turning point came with the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It was the largest military operation ever launched, and at first it looked like another victory. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured, and the Red Army seemed on the verge of collapse. But as the advance continued, the German army was stretched thin across thousands of miles. Supplies ran out. The Russian winter set in. For the first time, Hitler's generals began to see what he refused to admit, that this war could not be won through willpower alone. When the Battle of Stalingrad ended in disaster in early 1943, the illusion of invincibility was shattered. Hitler had refused to let General Paulus withdraw even as his army was surrounded. 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, and the defeat marked the beginning of the end. After that, the generals' faith in Hitler was replaced by fear and silent resentment. They continued to obey his orders, but their loyalty was no longer belief, it was survival. On every front, Hitler's decisions became more reckless. He refused to allow retreats, ordered counterattacks with units that no longer existed, and dismissed commanders who questioned him. Men like Erwin Rommel, once loyal and admired, began to doubt his leadership. By 1944, that doubt turned into resistance. The July 20th assassination attempt was the clearest sign that Hitler had lost the confidence of his army. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg and a group of officers planted a bomb inside Hitler's headquarters, hoping to end his rule and negotiate peace. The attempt failed, and the aftermath was brutal. Hundreds of officers were arrested and executed. Those who survived learned that even silence could be dangerous. After that, the generals followed orders because they had no choice. As the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviets from the east, Germany's military situation became hopeless. By early 1945, the front lines had collapsed. Cities were destroyed by constant bombing, and civilians fled in chaos. Yet in the bunker beneath Berlin, Hitler continued to issue commands as if victory were still possible. He ordered counterattacks by divisions that no longer existed, and demanded loyalty from generals who no longer believed. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was grim. Those who remained could see that the war was lost. But to question Hitler was still dangerous. He spent his final days accusing his officers of betrayal, blaming them for failures that were the result of his own decisions. His temper was uncontrollable, his health rapidly failing, and his mind consumed by paranoia. By the last week of April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. Soviet troops were closing in, artillery fire shook the city, and the sound of battle could be heard from inside the bunker. Hitler's generals, realizing the end was near, began to disappear. Some went to negotiate surrender, others tried to escape west to the Americans. The man who had once demanded absolute loyalty was now abandoned by the very people who had built his empire. On April 29, Hitler married Eva Braun and dictated his final will. He appointed Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor and blamed Germany's defeat on his generals, accusing them of cowardice and betrayal. The next day, as the Soviets reached the heart of Berlin, Hitler and Eva Braun took their own lives. Their bodies were carried outside, doused in fuel, and set on fire in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Above ground, the city was burning. Below, the bunker was silent. The generals who had once sworn allegiance to their Führer had walked away, leaving him to die alone. The empire that was meant to last 1,000 years had fallen in 12. In the days that followed, Germany surrendered. The surviving generals were captured, interrogated, or executed. Some tried to justify their actions as duty. Others admitted what they had long known, that their loyalty had prolonged the war and cost millions of lives. The night Hitler was left to die was more than the collapse of a regime. It was the moment when fear could no longer command obedience. And when the myth of Hitler's power finally ended, not through battle, but through silence, abandonment, and the quiet betrayal of those who once called him their leader. By mid-April 1945, Berlin was no longer a functioning capital. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night. Streets were filled with rubble, smoke, and frightened civilians moving between ruins. The once proud Reich was collapsing block by block. Deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler remained in his underground headquarters, the Führerbunker, refusing to accept reality. The bunker had been designed as a temporary shelter, not a command center for a dying empire. Its walls were concrete, its air stale, its corridors narrow and dim. In these last days, it became the center of a world shrinking by the hour. Hitler's entourage, secretaries, aides, and a few loyal officers, lived in constant fear. Above them, the thunder of Soviet artillery reminded everyone that the end was near. Hitler still held briefings twice a day. He demanded reports on units that no longer existed and issued orders to armies that had already been destroyed. Maps on the walls showed front lines that were weeks out of date. No one dared to correct him. The generals who remained, men like Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hans Krebs, and Helmuth Weidling, struggled to balance obedience with the knowledge that the war was lost. When General Weidling informed him that Berlin's defenses could hold only a few more days, Hitler exploded in anger. He accused his officers of cowardice and treason. He ordered them to defend every street, every bridge, and every house. He still believed that the city could be saved, that reinforcements from the north would break through and drive back the Soviets. But those reinforcements did not exist. Inside the bunker, food was scarce and the air thick with tension. Hitler's health had deteriorated drastically. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his movements were slow, and his voice often slurred. Those who saw him described a man decades older than his age, consumed by exhaustion and rage. He rarely went above ground. When he did, he found the garden of the Chancellery cratered by explosions and the once grand city reduced to ash. As Soviet forces entered the suburbs of Berlin, some officers began quietly making plans to escape. They knew that to remain was to die. Hitler forbade anyone from leaving without his permission, yet people disappeared every night. Drivers, guards, and aides slipped away, hoping to reach the Western Front and surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets. Hitler either did not notice or no longer cared. He had withdrawn completely into himself. On April 20th, his 56th birthday, he emerged briefly from the bunker to greet a handful of soldiers, mostly teenagers from the Hitler Youth. It was his final public appearance. As he handed out medals, witnesses saw a man broken and detached, staring past those around him as if already elsewhere. That same day, Soviet artillery reached the outskirts of the city. The last phase of the battle for Berlin had begun. Over the next week, the situation inside the bunker worsened. The sound of explosions grew constant. Communication with the outside world was nearly gone. Rumors spread that Himmler was trying to negotiate surrender behind Hitler's back. When Hitler learned of it, he flew into a rage and declared him a traitor. He ordered Himmler's arrest, even as the city above them was falling. To those still loyal, it was clear that the Führer no longer distinguished between reality and imagination. By April 25, Berlin was completely encircled. No supplies could enter, no one could leave. The city's defenders, soldiers, police, and civilians, fought street by street. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere turned surreal. There were reports of laughter one moment and despair the next. Some officers drank heavily. Others sat silently, waiting. Everyone understood that the end was approaching, yet no one dared to speak of it in front of Hitler. On April 28, word arrived that Benito Mussolini, Hitler's closest ally, had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. His body had been mutilated and hung upside down in a public square. When Hitler heard this, he realized what awaited him if captured. He vowed never to be taken alive. That night, he told his staff that the war was lost. He would stay in Berlin and die there. The following day, he married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony held in the bunker's map room. Afterward, he dictated his final political testament. He blamed Germany's defeat on his generals, accusing them of weakness and betrayal. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and ordered that his body be burned after his death. He shook hands with the remaining officers and dismissed them for the last time. By April 30th, the Red Army was within a few hundred meters of the Chancellery. Artillery shells shook the bunker walls. Hitler ate a final meal with his staff, said a few words of farewell, and retreated into his private quarters with Eva Braun. Shortly after, those in the corridor heard a single gunshot. When aides entered, they found Hitler dead from a self-inflicted wound. Eva Braun had taken poison beside him. Following his instructions, the bodies were carried upstairs to the Chancellery garden, doused in petrol, and set on fire. The flames lasted only a short time before fading under the falling shells. By then, the Soviet troops were already closing in on the building. For those who remained, the bunker became silent. The leader who had demanded absolute loyalty was gone. His generals, once symbols of discipline and obedience, had abandoned him in his final hours. Some fled, others surrendered, and a few took their own lives. By nightfall, the bunker that had once been the nerve center of a world-conquering empire was nothing more than a tomb. Hitler's death did not stop the fighting immediately. Berlin continued to resist for 2 more days until General Weidling finally ordered surrender on May 2, 1945. When the shooting stopped, the survivors emerged from the ruins to find a city unrecognizable, a landscape of ash, silence, and loss. In the end, Hitler had been defeated not only by his enemies, but by his own system. His generals, once loyal to the point of blindness, had walked away. The loyalty he demanded had withered in the face of reality. When the moment came, they chose survival over devotion. The men who built his power on obedience died surrounded by the echoes of disobedience. The final days in the bunker revealed the truth behind the myth of absolute control. Fear can enforce silence, but it cannot create loyalty. When the walls of the Reich collapsed, so did the belief that had sustained it. The generals were gone, the empire was gone, and the man who had demanded everything from them was left to face the end, alone beneath the city he had destroyed. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Germany was a nation in ruins. The cities were burned out shells. Millions were homeless. The once proud German army had ceased to exist. Across Europe, the war was over. But for Hitler's generals, the end of fighting was only the beginning of a long reckoning, one that would test their conscience, their loyalties, and their humanity. In the days following Hitler's death, chaos filled the vacuum of leadership. His successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, attempted to hold what was left of the government together from the north. He knew that surrender to the Western Allies was the only way to save what remained of Germany from complete destruction. He sent envoys to Eisenhower's headquarters to negotiate, while the Soviets occupied Berlin and the East. The generals who had survived the collapse understood the same truth: the war was lost, and any further resistance would only mean more pointless death. One by one, German armies surrendered. In Italy, General Heinrich von Vietinghoff capitulated to the Allies. In the Netherlands and northern Germany, Field Marshal Montgomery accepted the surrender of the last organized forces. On May 7, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces in Reims. The following day, the war in Europe officially ended. For many of Hitler's senior commanders, the end brought both relief and humiliation. Men who had once commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers now found themselves prisoners of the very nations they had fought to conquer. They were flown to interrogation centers in Britain, France, and the United States. There, for the first time, they began to speak freely, some to justify, others to confess. In these post-war interrogations, a pattern emerged. Almost every general claimed that Hitler alone was responsible for Germany's downfall. They described him as erratic, delusional, and obsessed with total control. They insisted that they had only obeyed orders, that disobedience would have meant execution. It was a convenient defense, one that allowed them to separate themselves from the crimes of the regime. But the truth was more complicated. The generals had not been passive instruments. For years, they had enabled Hitler's wars. They had carried out his campaigns, enforced his commands, and stood by while atrocities unfolded behind their lines. They had sworn an oath not to Germany, but to Hitler personally, an oath they kept until it was no longer useful. Their silence had sustained the war long after it could be won. At Nuremberg, the Allies sought to expose that silence. The trials revealed the extent of the Wehrmacht's complicity in Hitler's system. Evidence showed that senior officers had participated in or ignored mass killings, slave labor, and the destruction of entire cities. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, promoted by the generals themselves after the war, began to crumble under testimony and documents. Still, many maintained the same narrative, that they were soldiers, not politicians, that their duty was to obey, not to question. For men like Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl, Hitler's top military staff, obedience became their downfall. At Nuremberg, both were convicted of war crimes and executed. Others, like Erich von Manstein, tried to reshape their legacy in post-war memoirs, portraying themselves as professional soldiers caught in a political storm they could not control. But history revealed something different, that many of them had seen the truth years before the end, and had chosen to remain silent. Those who survived imprisonment faced a nation that no longer recognized them. Germany, divided and occupied, had no place for its former heroes. In the West, a few were later released to advise on the creation of the new German army during the Cold War. In the East, others languished in Soviet camps, some never returning home. Their fates varied, but their reputations were forever shadowed by their association with Hitler. The personal reflections of these men in the years after the war reveal a deep, conflicting guilt. Some admitted they had failed to act when they should have. They spoke of fear, of duty, of the impossibility of rebellion in a system built on terror. Others showed no remorse at all, insisting that they had served honorably and that history would vindicate them. But history did not. What their testimonies made clear was that the destruction of Germany had not been caused by one man alone. It had been made possible by the obedience of many, by officers who had valued loyalty over truth, and silence over courage. Their failure was not only strategic, but moral. They had seen the madness, understood the consequences, and yet continued to serve until there was nothing left to save. In the years that followed, historians and survivors alike debated the same question. Were Hitler's generals victims of a tyrant, or partners in his crimes? The answer lies somewhere in between. They were both, trapped in a system they had helped create, loyal to a leader they had long stopped believing in, and too afraid to defy him even when defiance might have spared millions of lives. Their story serves as a reminder that power rarely collapses from external pressure alone. It decays from within. When obedience replaces judgment, and fear silences truth. When the time came to stand against Hitler, the generals hesitated. And by the time they realized their mistake, it was too late. The war had destroyed not only Germany, but the very ideals the army once claimed to represent: discipline, duty, and honor. Those words became hollow in the shadow of the crimes committed under their watch. In their silence, Hitler found his greatest weapon. And when that silence finally broke, so did his empire. After 1945, the surviving generals lived in a world that no longer feared them. They wrote books, gave interviews, and tried to shape how history would remember them. But no matter how carefully they chose their words, the truth remained unchanged. They had followed a man who demanded everything and gave them nothing. When they walked away from him, it was not in defiance, it was in exhaustion. And when he died, they did not mourn him. They simply moved on, leaving behind the ruins of the nation they had helped destroy. The night Hitler was left to die was also the night his generals were freed from his spell. But their freedom came too late to change anything. The empire was gone, the people were broken, and the oath they had once sworn had lost all meaning. Their legacy, like their leaders, was buried in the ashes of Berlin, a warning of what happens when loyalty replaces conscience, and silence becomes the language of power. When the guns of World War II fell silent in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Millions were dead. The Third Reich, once envisioned as a 1,000-year empire, had lasted only 12. And among the ruins stood the men who had once been Hitler's sword, his generals. They had survived the war, but now faced a new and unfamiliar battle, the battle to control how history would remember them. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, the Allies divided the nation into occupation zones. The generals were rounded up, interrogated, and in many cases, imprisoned. They were questioned not only about military decisions, but about the crimes committed under their command. For the first time, these men who had wielded immense power were forced to account for their actions. But few accepted responsibility. Instead, they began to craft a narrative that would define much of post-war German memory, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The argument was simple, that the German army had fought honorably, separate from the political crimes of the Nazi regime. According to this version, the generals were professional soldiers, not ideologues. They had merely followed orders, fighting for their country, not for Hitler's ideology. It was a story that many in the West wanted to believe. In a world already turning toward the Cold War, the Allies saw value in a strong, cooperative West Germany, and the generals' expertise became useful once again. Men like Erich von Manstein, Heinz Guderian, and Albert Kesselring played key roles in shaping this new image. In prison cells and later through memoirs, they portrayed themselves as patriots trapped in an impossible situation. They described their loyalty as professional duty, not political conviction. Hitler, they claimed, had hijacked their army and turned it into an instrument of destruction against their will. To the public, they presented themselves as victims of his madness, rather than its accomplices. These memoirs were widely read. In post-war Germany, they offered a version of the past that many civilians found comforting. If the army had remained honorable, then perhaps the nation itself was not beyond redemption. For a people struggling to rebuild amid the ruins, it was easier to believe that the crimes of the Reich belonged to a few fanatics, not to an entire institution. But the truth was harder to face. Documents uncovered by Allied investigators told a different story. Orders signed by Wehrmacht officers revealed their cooperation in atrocities on the Eastern Front. Mass executions, deportations, and scorched earth campaigns carried out under the guise of military necessity. The army had not been separate from the regime. It had been its backbone. While the SS carried out ideological extermination, the Wehrmacht provided the structure and discipline that made the system function. Still, the generals persisted in defending their image. When the Nuremberg trials concluded, only a handful of military leaders were convicted. Most were released within a decade, often hailed in West Germany as national heroes. By the 1950s, some of them were quietly advising the newly formed Bundeswehr, the armed forces of democratic West Germany. Their knowledge was valued, their past conveniently blurred. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht served multiple purposes. For the generals, it was self-preservation. For German society, it was a way to move forward without fully confronting the past. And for the Western Allies, it was politically useful in the new struggle against the Soviet Union. The narrative of professional, apolitical soldiers allowed West Germany to rearm under NATO while claiming moral separation from its Nazi past. Behind the public facade, however, many of the generals wrestled privately with guilt. Some spoke of moral compromise, others of obedience gone too far. Yet these admissions rarely reached the public. In interviews, they continued to shift blame onto Hitler, the SS, or vague circumstances of war. Few ever admitted that they had enabled the very system they now condemned. Historians who studied the war in the following decades began to expose these contradictions. As more archives were opened, it became clear that the generals' claims were half-truths at best. The army had been deeply involved in war crimes, especially in the Soviet Union and the Balkans. Operational reports and field orders revealed systematic cooperation with SS units in massacres and deportations. Even the so-called honorable officers had signed off on brutal measures that blurred the line between military duty and mass murder. The image they had built for themselves, the professional soldier untainted by politics, began to collapse under evidence. By the 1980s and 1990s, the myth had finally begun to unravel in the eyes of historians and the public. New generations of Germans, no longer burdened by wartime loyalty, demanded the truth. Exhibitions and documentaries exposed the atrocities committed by regular army units. The reputation of Hitler's generals, once seen as tragic professionals, was permanently tarnished. They were revealed not as innocent participants, but as willing collaborators in one of history's darkest regimes. Yet, for decades, their influence on how history remembered the war was immense. Their writings shaped how the West understood Germany's defeat, emphasizing military skill, downplaying ideology, and casting Hitler as the sole villain. This selective memory helped many Germans rebuild their pride without facing collective guilt. But it also delayed the nation's moral reckoning. The attempt to rewrite the past was not unique to Germany. It reflected a universal instinct, the desire to find meaning in defeat and to separate oneself from evil. For Hitler's generals, that meant presenting themselves as victims of a madman, rather than his enablers. For a time, they succeeded. But history has a longer memory than propaganda. The truth, once buried under years of denial, eventually surfaced. In the end, their legacy remains complex. They were not all monsters, nor were they martyrs. They were men shaped by duty, ambition, and fear, men who chose loyalty over conscience until it was too late. When the Reich fell, they saved themselves, not their country. And in the years that followed, They tried to save their reputations the same way, by walking away from the truth. The collapse of the Reich was more than a military defeat, it was a moral one. The generals who once stood at the height of power spent their final years defending their honor. But the world had already rendered its verdict. They had served a regime built on terror and destruction. And no amount of revision or rhetoric could erase the fact that when Hitler's empire crumbled, they had been part of it. Silent witnesses to its crimes, and architects of its fall. When the war ended, and the ruins of the Third Reich lay silent, the question remained. How could a system built on fear, obedience, and loyalty collapse so completely from within? Why did the same men who once swore eternal devotion to Adolf Hitler ultimately abandon him in his final hours? The answer lies not in a single moment of betrayal, but in a slow and painful erosion of faith. In the beginning, Hitler's power rested not only on fear, but on belief. The generals believed in his victories. They believed in his vision of national restoration, in the illusion that he alone could return Germany to greatness. Their obedience was not forced, it was willing. For years, his boldness had delivered results that traditional strategy could not. He broke treaties, defied nations, and triumphed. To those around him, it seemed as if history itself favored him. But absolute power always demands more than loyalty, it demands blindness. Hitler's generals had traded their independence for proximity to power. Their discipline became submission, their silence became complicity. By the time they recognized his madness, they were trapped inside it. Their authority depended on his approval, and their survival depended on his favor. In that environment, dissent was treason, and treason meant death. As the war dragged on, that illusion began to disintegrate. Defeats exposed the truth. Hitler's decisions were no longer guided by strategy, but by delusion. He ignored reality, distrusted experts, and replaced planning with wishful thinking. For the generals, each new defeat forced a quiet reckoning. They began to see that obedience was no longer an act of duty, but of destruction. By 1944, the breaking point had come. Some officers, like Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators, decided that loyalty to Germany meant defiance against Hitler. They understood that the only way to save their country was to end his rule. Their attempt failed, but their reasoning reflected a broader realization among the officer corps, that Hitler's leadership had become a death sentence for the nation itself. Those who remained loyal did so out of fear or habit, not conviction. They followed his orders because they had always followed orders. It was easier to obey than to question. But when the Red Army reached Berlin, even that instinct collapsed. No command, no ideology, no oath could justify dying for a cause that no longer existed. And so, one by one, Hitler's generals walked away, some physically, others morally. They left their leader to die in the same isolation he had imposed on everyone else. Their abandonment was not heroic, it was inevitable. Power built on obedience will always crumble when fear loses its hold. By the end, there was nothing left to fear, only the reality of total defeat. The generals had seen what Hitler refused to see, that the war was lost, and that the men they had served was finished. They walked away not out of courage, but because there was nowhere left to go. After the war, many of these men would spend years trying to explain their actions. They claimed ignorance, duty, or patriotism. They said they had no choice. But history shows that there is always a choice, to obey or to resist, to speak or to remain silent. Their tragedy was that they chose too late. When they finally rejected Hitler, it was not to save Germany, but to save themselves. The night Hitler was left to die was more than the fall of a dictator. It was the collapse of an entire system of belief, the final consequence of loyalty without conscience. The generals who once swore allegiance to their Führer discovered too late that obedience is not the same as honor. And that silence in the face of madness is itself a form of complicity. Their story offers a lesson that extends beyond the ruins of Berlin. It is a warning about the fragility of conscience under authority, about the ease with which discipline can become submission, and patriotism can become blindness. In times of crisis, the line between loyalty and destruction is often invisible, until it's too late to turn back. When the Soviet soldiers entered the Führerbunker, they found nothing of the men who had once ruled Europe. Only ashes, scattered and half-burned, buried in the rubble of the city he had promised to make eternal. His generals were gone. His armies were gone. And the empire he built on obedience had dissolved into silence. What remained was a lesson carved into the ruins of history. That power without restraint destroys both the ruler and the ruled. And that loyalty, when it is given to a man instead of to truth, becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. In the end, Hitler's death was not just the end of a war, it was the end of belief. The belief that one man's will could replace reason. The belief that obedience could substitute for judgment. And the belief that loyalty, even to madness, could still be called honor. The generals who walked out that night did not save him. They could not. They had already saved themselves. But in their silence, in their absence, in that final act of abandonment, they revealed the truth that every tyrant eventually faces. When the fear fades, and the illusion breaks, power dies alone.